Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Kamal Sagi, the Dean of Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Science, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you to this important and timely roundtable on anti-Semitism in contemporary American politics. As you all know, here at Vanderbilt, we're committed completely and totally to creating and maintaining a culture of openness, tolerance, and mutual respect. But as the recent tragic shooting in Pittsburgh and other recent horrific events remind us, such tasks is never over. We have to fully stay engaged in maintaining a dialogue on this front, and I'm so glad that we could have this forum here today. I want to thank Alison Schachter and her colleagues here on campus and in the greater Nashville community for doing all the work to make this event possible on campus here today, so we can all learn something about this really important subject. And I want to extend a especially warm welcome to our three distinguished panelists for making their time to come visit us here. We look forward to learning from your wisdom and insights. Thank you.
So, thank you, Dean Sagi, for those opening remarks. I'm Alison Schachter. I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program here at Vanderbilt. And I began organizing this event last spring in response to discussions with students that started with the 2016 presidential election. The sudden visibility of anti-Semitic political ads and the targeting of Jewish journalists in that election felt to me like a sharp departure from American political norms. Then, just weeks before the beginning of the fall semester in 2017, the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville took place. Far-right protesters chanting anti-Semitic slogans and sporting Nazi symbols violently marched in protest of the removal of Confederate monuments. Once again, I found myself talking to my students about the complex intersections between anti-Semitism and white supremacy in the United States. Why would white nationalists embrace Nazi anti-Semitism when their purported object of protest was the removal of Confederate monuments? Why were white nationalists chanting anti-Semitic slogans while also speaking in support of the State of Israel? These were questions that worried my students and also troubled me. I suspected, when I organized this, that the 2018 election might amplify anti-Semitic political discourse once again. But I had no idea that this would lead to the tragic mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We're now seeing political speech against Jews turning into violence and leading to a revision, I think, of our understanding of the place of Jews in America and American history. And I hope that this roundtable discussion can begin to address these questions about anti-Semitism in American politics and its entanglement with white supremacy in all of its forms. Now, I want to thank the American Studies program, the Political Science Department, and the E. Bronson England College for their support. And in addition, the Jewish Federation of Nashville and Middle Tennessee also for their generous support for this event. And I'll introduce our speakers today. We'll start with some opening statements. I'll pose some questions, and then we will open up discussion for questions from the audience. So Professor Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University and is past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Her new book, American Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, will be published by W.W. Norton in March during Women's History Month, so look out for that. Professor Jonathan Judakin is the Spence L. Wilson Chair in the Humanities at Rhodes College. He's the author of several books, including Jean-Paul Sartre and the Jewish Question, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of the French, and Naming Race, Naming Racisms. And hot off the press, was it last week that it came out, is his most recent work, which was editing and writing the introduction to a roundtable in the American Historical Review titled Rethinking Antisemitism. And finally, Barry Trachtenberg is the Rubin Presidential Chair of Jewish History at Wake Forest University, and his most recent book, from which he spoke about this afternoon, is The United States and the Holocaust, Race, Refuge, and Remembrance. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to everyone here. And we'll begin with some opening thoughts. So I'll start with you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this group. And as you said in your opening remarks, when we started talking about this, I actually went back to my emails. You contacted me last May, and we could never have envisioned that we would be talking about this topic in the wake of what is the worst event ever to happen on American soil in terms of loss of life and attack on a Jewish community. And the notion of a gunman breaking into Sabbath services and shouting, "All Jews must die," horrifies us. So American Jews have added another notch in the litany of these mass shooting crimes that run across the American experience and go back to the 1960s, the 1950s, and it's the most current one, but there's a long history of such outbreaks of violence, but not always with such loss of life. So maybe later on I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for now, I want to remind everybody. So I'm an historian of the American Jewish experience, and I want to remind you that anti-Semitism has waxed and waned across the course of American Jewish history since the very first 23 Jews landed in New Amsterdam in 1654. And the governor of that colony, New Amsterdam of course became New York, but it wasn't that then, the governor of that colony didn't want the Jews to be there, and he wrote, quote, that he wanted to expel, quote, this deceitful race of hateful enemies and blasphemers. And he requested that the new territories should no more be allowed to be infected by these people of the Jewish nation. So had he succeeded, we wouldn't be here this evening, but of course he didn't. But that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism hasn't coursed throughout the American Jewish experience. So to bring us up to the very contemporary moment, have some slides of, since our topic for this evening is about Jews in American politics, I brought some slides that literally just came across my desk thanks to a reporter from like the day before the election. So here you can see one image of a candidate, Kim Schreier, and as you see, she's a Jewish candidate and she's holding dollar bills. Then you can see, if we go to the next one, this was an ad against Jesse Keel sent by the Republican Women of Juneau. All of these ads, by the way, were paid for by various legitimate Republican groups. The next one, here's businessman flyers from State Assembly candidate Tyler Deep's campaign, depicting his opponent Josh Lowenthal, and members of the Jewish community were calling it anti-Semitic. This one is unquestionably anti-Semitic. If you want to say that the others, and the reporter that I spoke with didn't know if non-Jews had been targeted with these images, but this one is unquestionably evocative, not only of medieval images of Jews with bags of money and glaring looks, but also of what happened during the Holocaust. And then I brought you one more image from your own town, from 2016, same kind of thing, attacking a Jew with a bag of money, which Professor Schachter shared with me. And then the last one is the flyer. This is from Baltimore. These were left on stoops in the gutter and alleyways on the sidewalks of Baltimore on October 18th. And you can see that the Jews are taking over, and then the word for African Americans is partially blacked out. So the point is, thank you, Ellie, for showing those. So the point is that anti-Semitism is expressed across American society, not only with extremists and the kind of violence that we saw the other day, but that is also deeply embedded in this kind of imagery that's perpetrating a climate that allows for what happened at the Tree of Life. I'll pass it to my colleague.
Sometimes when you organize an event a long time away, you can't possibly foresee how timely such an event might be, and that's obviously the case tonight. We're gathering to discuss anti-Semitism in contemporary American life less than 2 weeks after the massacre in the Tree of Life Synagogue and on the eve of the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht. The latent post-Holocaust anxiety about anti-Semitism was manifestly triggered full force in Pittsburgh. The terrorists' bullets ricocheted through Jewish communities everywhere, through the very being of every Jew I know. We're slowly moving from post-trauma to grieving and assessment, and tonight should help us do that. I recently heard the historian of religion, Elaine Pagels, talk about grieving as a process of sharing suffering. And she said, what is powerful about it is that it opens people to their shared sense of vulnerability and fragility. American Jews now know in our hearts and guts what we've long known in our heads about the fear and shock European Jews feel with every incident of the murder of Jews simply because they are Jews. But we're also hopefully now more in touch with the reverberations African Americans experience every time they hear about another kid shot by a policeman, and as parents, they need to once more have the talk with their kids. We're more viscerally in tune with the pain that queers went through after the Pulse nightclub shooting. In my opening comments tonight, I want to talk about how we should act on these feelings. There are 4 things that I think that we can do to counter Judeophobia. The first thing that we can do is recognize that all racisms and forms of oppression are entangled. Judeophobia is linked with negrophobia and Islamophobia and xenophobia and homophobia and all other heterophobias. As the writer Albert Memmi termed the process of othering, marginalization and persecution in its most general form. By heterophobia, Memmi was pointing at the fear and anxiety provoked by the encounter with the other, and differences that genuinely challenge us because they stand for values and ways of life we find threatening and difficult to accept. Second, this means that we can check ourselves. We must examine our values and explore our biases, which are often unconscious until we do the work of self-examination. But be aware that examining your biases doesn't mean that they go away. We're all racists, Memmi explains, because underneath a thin veneer, we are naturally territorial, predatory beasts. And our biases have been institutionalized in cultural patterns and in organizations. What has to be learned and constantly reinforced as a norm is anti-racism. As a result, as Peter Beinart noted in a piece in The Atlantic assessing the results of Tuesday's election, in American history, and I'm quoting him here, mobilizing white people to protect their racial dominance is the norm. Cross-racial coalitions are the exception. Third, we can engage in self-examination by educating ourselves about the history and the consequences of racism. There are lots of great courses at Vanderbilt, no doubt, that focus on these issues. Marinate in them. If Pittsburgh or the Charlottesville torchlight parades opened your eyes to Judeophobia, then learn more about it. If you already know something about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, deepen your knowledge of slavery and segregation. If you're familiar with that history, but know little about Islam and Islamophobia, explore it. If you haven't learned about the history at the borderlands of America and the process of expanding our borders and then policing and militarizing them, dig into it. If you have queer friends, but have yet to take courses that focus on gender and sexuality, dive into them. My fourth point I'll introduce with a joke that Trevor Noah told on The Daily Show just before the election. He said that as Americans, we are voting on whether America is racist or openly racist. We have to recognize that racism and oppression are always connected to power, which makes it a political phenomenon that will only end when we engage in a sustained politics animated by anti-racism, committed to ending Judeophobia, Islamophobia, negrophobia, xenophobia, homophobia, and all other heterophobias. That is, ending all laws and social systems that privilege some groups over and against other groups. This, for me, is what is at stake tonight in a conversation about anti-Semitism in contemporary politics.
So I'd like to first thank Allison for convening this discussion and say how much I appreciate the work of Pamela and Jonathan, and I'm proud to be here with you tonight. For my opening comments, I'd like to touch upon, just briefly, how the recent attacks in Pittsburgh have been discussed both in the press and in the Jewish community, and express some of my concerns about the ways that our political system is refusing to confront white supremacy by deflecting attention outside of the United States and making this a conversation instead about Israel. The last few years, we've seen a number of high-profile killings. Some have been against black churches. It was the assault at Pulse nightclub on the Las Vegas Strip and at Parkland. We woke up this morning to the news there was another mass killing at a club in Southern California. Some of these shootings have occurred because of white supremacists, some by homophobes, and others for reasons that remain unclear. And so obviously there have to be conversations about gun control, about male violence, and the overall militarization of our society. These all need to be part of the discussions around the massacre at the Tree of Life. But we're here to talk about anti-Semitism, so we should also speak of another context. The week that ended with the murders in Pittsburgh began, we should please recall, with the murder of 2 African-American shoppers at a grocery store in Kentucky by a white supremacist who tried unsuccessfully to break into a black church. When his efforts were thwarted, he went on to hunt African-Americans wherever he could find them. And then we had the pipe bombs. Remember, there were pipe bombs just, very recently, right? Sent to prominent Democratic and activist leaders. And then that was the week that ended with the murders in Pittsburgh at a synagogue attended by one of my students. These killings happen in a context of skyrocketing white supremacy, which is being enabled and at times encouraged by our president, who himself is part of a larger rise of ethno-nationalist leaders in many parts of the world, who are insisting on the right to exclude entire peoples from the categories of citizen and to deny them equal protection under the law. But instead of talking about gun control or male violence or white supremacy, the response by many major Jewish organizations, by too many leaders in the Jewish intellectual and scholarly world, and by both Democratic and Republican political leaders, is to make this a conversation about Israel, attacking its critics and blaming the political left as at least partially responsible for this violence. This focus in the immediate aftermath on the killings is terribly misguided, and we have to recognize that to use this recent shooting as yet another occasion to insist upon uncritical support for the state of Israel is a mechanism for ignoring the actual threat to Jewish lives, to black and brown lives, to the lives of women, people perceived to be disabled, and Muslims, and queers, and trans, and immigrants, and all other groups who are literally under assault by exponents of ethnic nationalism, and those who enable of them because of political expedience. It's not to say that anti-Semitism is absent on the political left. It certainly isn't, and I'd be happy to discuss it. But it is to say that the real physical threat to Jewish lives in America today is coming from the right, by those who believe themselves emboldened by the hatred espoused by the president, and those in and out of Congress who support him. And so I fear we're at a moment when anti-Semitism is being ignored or even forgiven in order to shore up Zionism. Politicians who suppress support for Israel, like our president and all of my congressional representatives from North Carolina, get a pass for their white supremacy and their anti-Semitism. The most glaring example of this was the past week when the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Israel gave their uncritical support to Trump, who continued to make blatantly anti-Semitic comments about George Soros, even after the Tree of Life shootings. So I hope that we can use this discussion in part to focus on the real and persistent threat to American Jews, to consider how Jews face a threat similar to that of other minority groups, and to acknowledge our shared fate and struggle.
So Thank you all for your statements. My first question to you is that in the wake of the shooting, I'm wondering if it's prompting us to need to reconsider the history of anti-Semitism in America, which until recently, the scholarly consensus has been that anti-Semitism has been on the decline. Does this mean now that we're seeing this uptick of anti-Semitism that we have to rethink the place of Jews in the United States? Have we misunderstood all along the place of Jews in the American racial order? And I wanted to also read a quote from an op-ed piece in the Washington Post from November 1st that sort of raises a related set of questions. And this is by a scholar of Judaism at the University of Pennsylvania, I think, Lila Corin Berman. And she writes, as a description of American Jewish life, and here she's speaking of the idea of American exceptionalism, meaning that America is an exceptional place that providing a safe haven for Jews. So as a description of American Jewish life, exceptionalism has brushed under the rug the exclusion and discrimination Jews have faced. Worse, it has stood in the way of an honest reckoning with the violent possibilities that have long simmered under the surface of its claims. And she goes on to ask whether, quote, the opportunities and privileges we, by which she means Jews, gained came not because America held an actual particular promise for Jews, but rather because it withheld that promise in so many ways to so many other people. So I don't know which of you wants to sort of first take up that question, either Lila's quote or the sort of larger question about do we need to really reassess the place of Jews in American history and the American racial order?
So let me start with the first part of your question about the history, because I think what Professor Corin Berman is talking about is this long history of anti-Semitism in the United States that, first of all, people don't know so much about history, and secondly, it's not just that it got swept under the rug, but that actually we've been at a really different moment. Sociologists survey something called attitudinal anti-Semitism, and by all measures of various different kinds of surveys, they show that the attitudinal anti-Semitism in the United States declined between 1964 and 1998 and then kind of leveled off, and really low levels of anti-Semitism expressed when people are asked in surveys specific questions about whether or not they're anti-Semitic, and reached, almost its lowest levels, especially during the second Obama administration. And then, of course, starting in 2015, attitudes about anti-Semitism, the kinds of things that as Lila Corin Berman says, got swept under the rug, somewhat of an uptick. All of a sudden, things like that Barry was talking about, things that nobody would have said before because it was no longer acceptable to say such things in American life. People started saying them, and then anti-Semitic expression burst open in new ways. Meanwhile, there were new media for expressing anti-Semitism that those attitudinal surveys never get at. So on the web and in these various white nationalist groups and the different ways that they express it. And so, well, on the one hand, the Americans that we talk to, that we think, the rational people that we're involved with, they will never express anti-Semitism, whether it's got implicit bias or not. They're not going to express it. But there are so many other places in American life now where the kind of anti-Semitism that historically had resulted in things like synagogue bombings during the civil rights movement, that now that's acceptable in a way that it hasn't been for the past 60 years, 50 years.
I just want to say a couple things. One thing I've been trying to do in my work is to introduce distinctions into our conversation. So for me, one of the ways in which I think the conversation ends up getting muffled and occluded has to do with the vocabulary that we use. For me, I try to restrict anti-Semitism as a term really to the period from 1880 to 1945, and as a way of thinking about people who organize their worldview around their images of Jews and Judaism, for whom it is an all-encompassing ideology. So to measure attitudinal anti-Semitism, for me, this is an odd way of understanding what the Jewish American experience. Jews in America have unquestionably suffered from a history of prejudices, of discrimination at certain periods, and from episodic moments of violence. But in a lot of ways, when I think about the American Jewish experience from a global perspective as a Europeanist, in a lot of ways, I wouldn't use the term exceptional, because it's a term that I would problematize in all kinds of ways, but from a comparative perspective, the American Jewish experience has been unusual. Yeah, it's been extraordinary. And that has to do with the history in the United States of other races who are the primary targets. So one of the things I often say to my students is that Jews are to Europe what blacks are to America. And in the American experience, compared to, let's say, Asians at certain moments, Mexicans, and unquestionably in relationship to anti-black racism, the American Jewish experience has been extraordinary. And I think that part of what we don't want to do is to not recognize that particular experience, because it is connected to core American values, to a constitutional history, to the liberal foundations on which America was created, to the principles of freedom of religion. And as soon as we forget that and think about America somehow as from beginning to today, defined by an experience of the persecution of Jews, I think we're misdirecting the conversation.
I'll try to get at some of these issues in a slightly different way. And just, your question reminded me of the first 6 months or so of the Trump presidency when I was trying to write the conclusion to that book, which was basically making the argument that the relationship of America to the Holocaust changes over time in relationship to shifting racial attitudes towards Jews, or Jewish relationship, towards whiteness in America. And I kept having to revise and revise and revise because events kept spinning out of control. Like I thought I had it figured out and I was going to write this introduction in like a long weekend. And then, on January 27th, the day that Trump issues the first iteration of his travel ban, it's also International Holocaust Awareness Day. And the White House issues a statement about the Holocaust that makes no mention of Jews, right? And then there are cemeteries where gravestones are knocked over around in different parts of the country. And then there are all those bomb threats to Jewish federations and schools, and it turns out the person making them was an Israeli, right? But it just led to this climate of an Israeli Jew, it led to this climate of fear. And then you have President Trump, when asked about is he contributing to the climate of anti-Semitism, starts attacking an Israeli Jewish journalist, saying no one is less anti-Semitic than me, and holding up his Jewish grandbabies as somehow cover for him. And then Spicer says that Hitler never used chemical weapons, and it just goes on and on and on, right? And so I was just like scribbling, rewriting, and finally at Charlottesville I had to end it. Right? But what was happening at the same time as these questions was that there was this series of articles in the Jewish press about saying, are Jews still white in America? So there was this real kind of serious round of questioning. And what was being called into question in part was this bargain that Jews made. Because as Jonathan and Panelist both sort of indicated, when Jews came to America in large numbers, there was already a pre-existing color line. And yet it wasn't clear where Jews were going to fit on it. It was clear that most Jews coming from, Jews coming from Europe weren't black, but it also wasn't fully clear that they were white. But whiteness was something that Jews could attain by taking certain steps to sort of assert that whiteness, to behave in ways that whites expected. That meant trying to gain access to white-only institutions by participating in segregation in different ways. Also, for many Jews, that meant fighting oppression and trying to undo Jim Crow. So you have both responses. But certainly after World War II, Jews, like other sort of ethnic whites, leave the cities, they move out to the suburbs, they join social organizations that had been prohibited to them earlier and were still prohibited to African Americans. And so in this bargain, and as a way of gaining equality, which is really privilege, Jews sort of, collectively sort of made some choices here. And those choices are now being questioned to some extent. And I think the one sort of benefit of this is it's forcing, I think, the Jewish community to confront some of the decisions about that were made for many, many generations previously, and recognizing that what we've assumed to be equality has really been just attaining a status of whiteness, which is now being called into question.
Thank you. So we had wanted to talk a little bit about history in this panel, and I was going to open it first to Pam, because I know you were going to speak a little bit about the temple bombing, and so I'll pass it to you, and then Barry was going to speak for a few minutes about the FDR and the Holocaust. So why don't I pass it on to you, Pam? So
in October 1958, October 12th, 1958, it's almost 60 years ago, there was a nitroglycerin bomb that exploded at the temple in Atlanta. And some of you may remember the film Driving Miss Daisy, or the play Driving Miss Daisy, that this figures in that. And it exploded in the wee hours of the morning, so there was no loss of life. Had it exploded at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning when all the kids were in Hebrew school, it would have been catastrophic. But it was the fourth bombing, synagogue bombing that year, and when historians look back on the attacks on African Americans during the 50s and the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, and they know that 90% of the attacks were on African American institutions, but the other 10% of attacks, violent attacks, bombs planted in JCCs, many of which never went off, bombs planted in rabbis' houses, that 10% of those attacks, they were on Jews in American life. So I hear you when you say, and I teach American Jewish history. I don't teach it as a history of anti-Semitism. But if I look for those moments of anti-Semitism, and I see from Stuyvesant all the way up until today, I could pull those all out and write a history of the American Jewish experience through an anti-Semitic lens. And Barry's right, there's been an extraordinary change in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and the end of the formalized quotas and restrictive covenants and the laws that discriminated against Jews. But it's clear to me that this strand of anti-Semitic violence courses through American history, and it pops up every once in a while when, and I think there's a reason, this is about contemporary politics, when the contemporary political moment allows for it to crop up.
So this is just a point to an earlier period, some 2 decades prior, in the late 1930s, and really the entire interwar period is another moment when anti-Semitism in the United States, we see a pretty sharp spike. You probably know this history better than I do, Pamela, but there's a blood libel in Messina, New York in the early 1920s where a non-Jewish girl goes missing for a period of hours. It's during the time of the Jewish high holidays. People start gathering outside of the synagogue to demand that the Jews return the girl. And there's this fear struck in the community that really hadn't experienced this prior, and the girl comes wandering out of the woods several hours later. But then you have this larger environment where after World War I, in America, there's this growing sense of isolationism, which is just really another way of talking about race, where the United States doesn't want to get involved in world affairs, but that also means that to many white Americans, there's this sense that they don't want to let foreigners in any longer. There's this strong anti-immigrant bias, and the immigration laws are reshaped in such a way as to favor northern white Europeans, and so large numbers of people from Britain can come into the United States every year. Large numbers of people from Germany can come into the United States. But people from most other countries, they see the numbers really quite limited. From some countries, it's down to 100. And we should be very clear that no person who's perceived to be disabled is allowed to come into the country as an immigrant in this period. There's just an outright ban in the legislation, in the regulations. This environment of hostility towards migrants, towards others, towards those from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, then gets played out in America itself, and Jews begin experiencing all sorts of hostility. And when Hitler comes to power, even though the United States is ultimately opposed to Nazism, it doesn't mean that's a repudiation of anti-Semitism. And what we see is that anti-Semitism spikes in the United States, especially in the late 30s. Hitler, what he does is he really lowers the bar in terms of what's acceptable speech to make about Jews anywhere. And so we have figures like Charles Coughlin, who was the Alex Jones of his day, I guess, or Rush Limbaugh, right? With 2 million radio listeners making full-on anti-Semitic speeches from Chicago, saying things, days after Kristallnacht, saying that, once we get to the Jews, they'll think they had it easy in Germany. You have, later, you have figures in Congress. You have Charles Lindbergh making his famous speeches once the war begins in the name of keeping America out of the war. So it's this time of really great fear. But again, this then too, it happens in a context of a much larger fear-mongering against other racialized groups in the United States. We see spikes in lynchings of African Americans. There's a time in the late 20s and 1930s, nearly 1 million people of Mexican ancestry are forcibly deported from the United States, something that begins under Hoover and continues through Roosevelt. We have attacks, of course, during the war on people of Japanese ancestry here in the United States. Really, the Aryanization of their property. Relocated to concentration camps. I mean, this is the climate, and it's in this climate that anti-Semitism spikes once again. And so, as I think Jonathan and Pamela have stressed very clearly, anti-Semitism happens within a climate of larger racial fear-mongering, just as today.
Well, and you remind me that Philip Roth wrote a novel 10 years ago called The Plot Against America, in which he imagines what would happen under a Lindbergh presidency. 2004, what would happen under a Lindbergh presidency. Yeah. So, Jonathan, you recently wrote an op-ed piece entitled White Christian Nationalism and Terrorism in Pittsburgh. Why?
First of all, Bowers, the terrorist who goes into the Tree of Life synagogue, had scrolled on his social media posts a quote that comes from John 8:44, Jews are the children of the devil. And I began with that and tried to look at the ways in which there is this long history of Christian anti-Judaism that has been picked up by white nationalists and is important to their ideology. It's also important because of the nature of a lot of these groups. They're interested in returning to a vision of America that's shaped by this idea of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. And that Christian aspect of their whiteness, it seems to me, is important to signal and to call out. It's also important because of the larger history of whiteness itself in America. White supremacy is connected to groups' ability, as a result of color-coded racism, to become a part of the larger white dominant group in the United States. And so when Catholics, for example, the Irish, immigrate into the United States, they go through a process that's analogous to what Barry was talking about in terms of Jews not being seen as neither white nor black, and that is in part connected to their Catholicism. So they're tarred with the same kinds of epithets initially as circulate around African American bodies until they become a part of the white group in the United States. And the same thing is true of Italians. And so if we're going to understand something about the history of whiteness in America, it's also connected in part to a particular kind of Christian identity. And then the other thing that I wanted to really signal is the issue of indifference and the ways in which Christian evangelicals who support Trump and the right-wing Republican agenda in the United States today, the numbers are something like more than 80% of evangelical Christians who give their support to it, who oftentimes are preaching a message of Christian love, but who are indifferent to the experience of people who are fleeing their homes because they are fleeing situations of dire violence, who are indifferent to the experience of people being shot simply because they're suspected and feared to be criminals. The latest data on evangelicals seems to support the notion that actually they're actively opposed to immigration into the United States. So there's a cross-correlation between the kinds of policies in the Trump administration and the ways in which those policies have supported people like Bowers, radicalized on the internet, like Islamic jihadists self-radicalized and engage in acts of terrorism. But in this case, by internalizing a long Christian ideology that has been hostile towards Jews. So for me, I think it's important to understand this isn't only a function of white nationalism, but of white Christian nationalism if we're really going to understand what's going on with right-leaning politics in America today.
Great. So one of the things that we discussed amongst ourselves as we were preparing for this roundtable is thinking about anti-Semitism both in an American context but also an international context, and grappling a little bit with the figure of President Trump in a larger context of right-wing political leaders espousing anti-Semitism. And so I wanted to put up a cartoon for all of you to see. This is a cartoon by Eli Valley, which he posted on Twitter. And it is an image of Netanyahu saying, "To our brothers and sisters in America, the state of Israel says solidarity," while painting the epithet, racial epithet kaik, on an image of George Soros. And I think this image captures an enormous complexity of what's happening today. How do we understand why a figure like Netanyahu, representing the state of Israel, might be apologizing for the anti-Semitic speech of leaders like Viktor Orban, who was invited to Israel after his election, during which there was an enormous amount of anti-Semitic speech, or Trump? So what's going on with kind of the global politics? What is going on with the relationship between Israel and the United States, and how this links to a discourse about anti-Semitism? And this is really a huge question. So I'll ask each of you to comment on the cartoon or some aspect of it, and then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. So
I think...
And I know it is a disturbing image.
Right. So I think the one thing I want to say is that we are at a moment where there is an extraordinary divide between American Jews and Israeli Jews, and it's the largest divide that we have ever seen. And the Israeli Jews do not understand, and I have this not only from what I've read in the polls, but also from spending 10 days with a group of Israeli master's candidates who come to the United States. Israeli Jews do not understand that American Jews are deeply invested in a civil rights and liberal agenda, not only because they think that that's the right thing to do, but frankly because they also understand that that agenda is critical to their safety and security in the United States. And Israeli Jews are enamored of Trump. He has moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He got rid of the Iran deal, and for them the bottom line is whatever is good for Israel should obviously be good for America's Jews. And so there's this moment of a critical divide between the two groups.
I guess I want to say that we're at a moment of profound paradox or Jews being caught in a whole series of double binds. And in a way, that image speaks to that. Trump obviously has members of his family, Jared Kushner, very close to the levers of power. He's obviously been strongly supportive of Netanyahu and the Israeli right. He's moved the capital to Jerusalem. At the same time that he engages in the winks to the white Christian nationalist base that help to allow, that really have dredged the swamp. When he promised to dredge the swamp, he did dredge the swamp. The swamp monsters are amongst us. They are out in full force now. And Jews end up being caught in the crossfire here. In part, what that does is to help reinforce the discourse that we sometimes hear on the left that associates Israel with white supremacy, with colonialism, with racism, with apartheid. Because what is being reinforced is this connection between whiteness and power. And it seems to be the case that Jews have unprecedented levels of power, at the same time that you have a sense of vulnerability because of all of the kinds of experiences that Pamela and Barry have talked about as underpinning the experience. That while America has been a good place for Jews, underneath many of these aspects, we know that not too far beneath the skin, there is the potential of violence and terror, of exclusion underneath it. And so it's an extremely complicated time in American history for Jews.
So I'm actually going to ask Ellie to put the image back, if you don't mind, for a second. Sorry. Because I noticed something that I didn't notice before. So I'm not familiar with this cartoonist, and I looked him up, and it turns out he lived just across the river from me, from where I lived for 13 years, it seems, in Troy, New York, and I was in Albany. But never met him. So there's something interesting. He signs his name, and then he writes 2018, and then he writes Zachor underneath in Hebrew, which is the commandment to remember. And so I don't know if he always signs with Zachor.
He does this for this cartoon.
For this cartoon,
yes.
Yeah. And so it's a commandment, right? So it tells us that we're supposed to remember something. And it's like, so I'm just, I'm not sure what it is necessarily that we're supposed to remember here, but
I think it's Pittsburgh.
Say again?
Pittsburgh. I mean, this is.
You think it's just a memory for Pittsburgh? It could be. What it's making me sort of think of in part, though, is sort of what's happening between the relationship in part between Zionism and Judaism. At the early stages of the Zionist movement, it was a minority movement among the Jewish people. It was one response of many responses to this outburst of anti-Semitism that started in the 1880s in Russia, and then it manifested itself in France, and then in Germany, and all different parts of Europe, and also later, soon after, in the United States. And there were many, many responses. It was a minority movement. It was only until after World War I, and then really with the rise of Nazism, that increasing numbers of Jews really begin ascribing to Zionism as the answer to the Jewish problem. Right? That Jews need a state of their own. States will give security. States will provide a community that has been sort of torn apart by all these forces. And so we begin seeing that Judaism and Zionism begin merging. And certainly after World War II, the creation of the state, and by the 1960s, for most American Jews, support of Israel is really essential to their Jewish identity. But what I think is happening in the last few years is we're starting to see a split in some ways where Zionism is becoming more important than actual Jewish lives, and support for the state of Israel is becoming more important than actual lives, because we're seeing that anti-Semites are getting a pass on their anti-Semitism if they come out in support of Israel. So Trump can again do all this anti-Semitic dog whistling, but he gets a pass on it because he moved the embassy. right?
And just building out, the other thing I want to just note about that image is the figure of Soros here, who is supposed to represent Jews and the international Jewish conspiracy. And what we're seeing here is a demonization of Soros as a representative of the left as well as Jews, right? So that Democrats and the left in particular are being Judaized and viewed within this context of of this international Jewish conspiracy. So it's really bringing back an older trope. Did you want to add?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about Zachor because Zachor is always used with remember Amalek. Yeah. And so the question, so the enemy of the Jews, and the question is who's the enemy? And it could be that he's referring to Netanyahu. Yeah.
So let's now open the floor for questions from the audience. And Ellie, do you want to bring, we'll pass her one of the microphones. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. Great.
Hi guys, thanks for coming. You've spoken a lot about anti-Semitism on the right, which is well documented, and we all kind of know about that. But I'm surprised that none of you has mentioned what we're seeing from the left. For example, Omar and Rashida Tlaib, who were just elected this week, are openly anti-Semitic. The charter of Black Lives Matter, very anti-Israel. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the very, very open and it seems like predominant hatred coming from the left as well.
Great, thanks for raising that question. That is something else that we've been talking about. Just, do you want to start, Pam?
So it's very much like what Jonathan was getting at, and that is that Jews are in the crossfires everywhere at the moment, and are in a very difficult position because Jews should be able to make coalitions with not only Black Lives Matter, but also with the women's movement. And yet the anti-Semitism expressed by leaders in both movements have made those incredibly uncomfortable spaces for Jews to be in. And so the question is, maybe one of you has a better answer, but the question is, how much has the anti-Semitism on the right stoked what's acceptable to say in terms of the movements on the left? So, does it matter? I think so.
Why does it matter?
Yeah. Barry, did you want to jump in?
I can try to respond to some of that. I think it's really important to distinguish between statements that are critical of Israel and anti-Semitism, that they're not one and the same thing. I think they're often made out to be one and the same. I think there certainly is anti-Semitism on the left. You know, I've seen it, I've experienced it. I think it comes at times when activists demand of Jews that they have a stance on Israel, sort of as a condition for participating in certain coalitions. But I think we have to recognize that to many activist people, the policies, especially of recent years, of the state of Israel are putting it on the side of many oppressors. And so there are many people, many Jews among them, who don't want to engage with Israel and who have very, very sharp criticisms of Israel, of its policies, of its principles, of its founding ideals. And that's not necessarily anti-Semitism. It can be anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's a mask for anti-Semitism, and we have to be really careful. But I don't necessarily believe that the Black Lives Matter movement is somehow profoundly anti-Semitic, or these candidates who've come to office.
No, if you look at the platform, okay, it's a very, very long and complicated document that was created through a series of interlocked committees. And there's one line, basically, in that whole document which suggests that there's a genocide taking place in Israel against Palestinians. Now, that charge is patently absurd. There's absolutely no doubt about that. If you just look at demographic data alone, we know how ridiculous that charge is, because there's one of the issues that's driving what's going on in Israel has to do with the demographics on the ground and the birth of Palestinians relative to the birth of Jews, okay? But I agree, one of the problems with this conversation is the term anti-Semitism itself. To characterize that platform as anti-Semitic when it calls out so many other kinds of injustices all around the world, and it also names the injustices that are going on in Israel, to me, this seems to be a complete distortion and a misconstrual of what is actually going on. And that's one of the things that I think that we need to do, is have some perspective about what each of these instances mean. And I think one thing that you can do is, if you cull from any history, any movement, any group, and line up all together the mistakes and misstatements and things that they end up getting wrong, you can pull together an argument that makes them seem as if they are anti-Semitic. To me, that seems a complete misconstrual of the Black Lives Matter movement. I was really upset when I read that line. It seems to me incredibly unfortunate, because from my perspective, this is one of the, arguably the most important political movement in the last few years, and it was a way of shutting down the building of allies and the necessity of coalition building that is necessary to fight precisely the white supremacy that Black Lives Matter is committed to addressing. But nonetheless, it needs to be put into perspective, okay?
Let's take another question.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm a graduate student here. So in one of Bauer's, the terrorist final posts, he was calling out HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is now this largely non-Jewish immigration or organization that helps immigrants come to America and resettle. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on, even though he obviously was indiscriminate in who he was terrorizing, is it not just this general anti-Semitism, but the specifically liberal American Jewish anti-Semitism? And is there a difference? Does it matter?
He wasn't indiscriminate. I mean, the article to read on this, I think, is by Eric Ward, and he talks about the centrality of anti-Semitism to white supremacy. It's completely central to understand the role of the Jew as puppet master, orchestrating behind the scenes a series of policy positions that ultimately he's opposed to, that have to do with the browning of America, of immigrants coming into America, of Muslims who are going to transform America. So that overlapping discourse that I was talking about is absolutely there and completely central to the way that Bowers was radicalized, is the role of anti-Semitism within that. In other words, it really is a worldview that has shaped how he came to see and understand the world. HIAS is one piece of that, but it was not him randomly choosing a place to go. He went into a synagogue to kill Jews. That was the reason why they were targeted.
No, they're recording.
Hello again. So in European history, we can sort of trace out the change from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism. Where do we see that in American history? Do we have the same kind of flip or transition into the anti-Semitism versus like anti-Judaism based upon just religious beliefs?
So we can also trace it in American history. So when you have President John Quincy Adams, who belongs to a Society for the Amelioration of the Jews, which is a society to missionize against Jews, we very clearly have traditional Christian anti-Semitism. And by the way, those attitudinal surveys that I talked about, they also measure kinds of traditional Christian forms of anti-Semitism, and it's higher than the kind of broader attitudes against Jews. They ask questions about, Jews as enemies of Christ, that kind of thing. So that still exists, but the shift comes with the notions of racial ideology at the end of the 19th century. And what is really interesting is that Jews themselves are debating back then whether they're a race or a religion. And even though they, some of them they'll say things like, you're such a credit to the race. And they actually see a racial definition at the end of the 19th century an advantageous way of understanding who they are, because they continue to get called out as distinctive even when they don't have anything to do with the religion. So that's where the turn, where you can begin to see the turn. But you may want to talk about it also, because you talk about the 20s.
I was going to add a small piece.
Yeah.
I constantly learn from you, so I appreciate even what you just said.
I learned from you.
But what you see in census records and also in the statements when people are identifying coming to Ellis Island, they're writing down Hebrew as their race, right? And of course, they're not necessarily writing, it's being written down for them by, whether it's the census takers or by the immigration officials. But Hebrew is really thought of as a racial category. And it wasn't something that Jews themselves were rejecting. Jews themselves were questioning. They were part of this racial reordering that was underway. And there were times where it seemed to be advantageous to identify as a separate race. In time, though, I think that seems to go away, where it seems that whiteness is really the pathway to prosperity.
You stand up and
Wait, there's another question.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm a graduate student, and one theme of the presentations today was a lot of overlap between racisms and anti-Semitisms in American history. But I was also struck by what felt to me like perhaps less attention to differences. And specifically, I'm curious what you think about, there's much, all the images of Jews have to do with money and this kind of secret cabal of people in power who are like behind the scenes and in control of everything we do. But then, anti-black thought is much more about blood purity and the history of just the one drop rule. And Central American immigrants right now is like a notion of invasion. And these three things seem to me to be like fundamentally different, even if the climate is generating extreme forms of all of them. At the same time, even if at another level our attitudinal responses to them should be somewhat shared. So I just wonder what you think about the difference at the level of ideas, something like that.
I'll start. One of the things that's happened in a lot of studies of anti-Semitism is to disaggregate it from other forms of racism. American exceptionalism is sort of been critiqued in all kinds of ways in the historiography about America, and it seems to me that it's time to critique exceptionalism when it comes to the historiography about anti-Semitism. There are, of course, unique elements and important differences. We have to Venn diagram these things, but it seems to me that we actually understand much more about the past when we look at these entanglements and when we understand racisms in a multi-directional kind of way. The kind of work that Barry's just finished. He gave a talk this afternoon about his book on the United States and the Holocaust, by looking at it in the context of shifting structural forces that are at work in the history of racism in America. We actually end up getting a different, and I think more nuanced, more contextually specific understanding of the Holocaust itself. With that being said, I think that one useful way to pull these things apart was an observation that was made by one of the great historians of anti-Semitism, I think the doyen of the field, Leon Poliakov. And what he argued was that when you look at these two racisms, anti-black racism and anti-Jewish racism, we can look at the core tropes that define them. And the core association with Jews is the association with the devil. That's why that passage going back to John 8:44 is so important, because it has this long, toxic afterlife. this association of Jews with evil, Jews as the minions of the devil working to bring about the evil forces in the universe. When you look at the core trope of anti-black racism, it's the association of blacks with beasts of burden. And this has to do with the differences between the two ways these racisms work. It's because anti-black racism has primarily been used as a mechanism for the justification of oppression and exploitation. When it comes to the history of Jews, it's more complicated because oftentimes anti-Jewish discourse has often been about imagining the nature of salvation or imagining the ideals of what the body politic should look like and working that out by thinking about the Jewish body by extension. And so there are these different histories and we could pull them apart, but it seems to me that we're at a moment in our understanding of the nature of the phenomenon where actually we end up learning a lot more through comparative and entangled histories by understanding the interconnections between these differing but nonetheless overlapping racisms.
Question? Maybe we take another question or two. Yeah.
Oh, wait, okay. So how do you think Jews across the religious divide from Reform Jews to Orthodox Jews, and then the reflected ideological structure of liberal Jews being more Reform, Orthodox Jews being more politically conservative, how do you think they can kind of reconcile that and come together to fight anti-Semitism, but then also have a platform with Israel, because it kind of seems like those can both conflict?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what you're asking is the impossible, because I think you're asking, Orthodox Jews and Reform Orthodox Jews, many of whom don't want to, have anything to do with Reform Jews, and how they could come together to fight anti-Semitism. I'm also thinking of, was it the chief rabbi of Israel who didn't mention that the shooting was in a synagogue? Wouldn't use the word synagogue. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that they're likely to join together to fight anti-Semitism. I think that the current struggle against anti-Semitism has probably breathed new life into the historic Jewish agencies that were founded around the turn of the 20th century, and they will find themselves in stronger positions than maybe they had been for a long period of time. When so, like the Anti-Defamation League had more or less begun to universalize some of its work, won't have to do that anymore. But it would be great if they would come together, but I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I mean, you have, during the crisis of Nazism, in a moment when there was sort of great expectation that the Jewish community would come together, they were never more divided in terms of their approach. You have the political extremes on the left and the right who are marching in the street, who are protesting against Roosevelt. And you have a center that is trying to get close to him, and hopefully through personal connections and influence. And they're choosing what some people call, the Shah still approach, like just be quiet, don't make too much noise. We'll be able to make our point that way. And so you have this bitter infighting at some of the worst moments. And the only other analogy I can think of is what was happening in Germany at this time period, where Jews are forced to spend time with one another because they're banned from all other spaces in society. And literally the only places where Jews can gather, Jewish cemeteries, by the late 1930s, early 40s, there's no place left together. And so that's the only moment I've ever sort of seen in the modern period where there's actually real strong unity within a community.
Well,
I would actually say something a little different. I mean, so I do think that there are important differences over Zionism and over the State of Israel. But I actually think that one of the ways that the Jewish community comes together, and one aspect of shared Jewish identity that has become a central aspect for Jews, is opposition to anti-Semitism. It doesn't matter actually whether you're a conservative Jew, a Reform Jew, an Orthodox Jew. Everybody agrees this is a serious problem, and there's anxiety across all aspects of the Jewish community, a kind of low-level anxiety post-Holocaust that all Jews share in common. So, all Jews share in common a sense of the relationship to the Holocaust and what it meant, a sense of the importance of Israel, and a shared sense that anti-Semitism has to be opposed. Now, they may have very different notions of how exactly you oppose it. So what Pamela was talking about in terms of liberal Jewish convictions, 70% of Jews approximately in the United States are liberal, and most Jews who are affiliated are Reform Jews, right? Those numbers are going to change in the next 50 years. But they understand something about the relationship to civil rights and struggles for equality and shared coalition building, and there's a long history of those sorts of things. So actually, I think there's more in common, and one thing that I wouldn't want to suggest in answer to your question is that somehow liberal Jews don't take the problem of anti-Semitism seriously. I think they do come from the perspective of what Barry said, which is they understand something about differences between critique of Israeli policies and anti-Semitism, right? And where it gets complicated is with anti-Zionism specifically, and what that means.
I just want to jump in too to add that I think what's really important is that Jewish institutions need to reject white Christian nationalists as allies with Jewish nationalism, and that until Jewish institutions, Jewish individuals need to, people need to press and make this happen, until white nationalism can be disarticulated from Jewish nationalism, we are going to continue to have a crisis that's going to prevent the Jewish community from calling out anti-Semitism, because I think there is a problem. I don't think everybody is afraid of anti-Semitism or is not recognizing it, and we need to name it when we see it and not be afraid to call it out, and so I do think that's part of it. We have time for one last question. Yeah, over here.
Thank you. So I prepared a question earlier that was partially asked at the beginning, but I've heard dismissal of left-wing anti-Semitism. And I'd like to point out that I would argue that the most prominent and most influential open anti-Semite in America today is Louis Farrakhan. And he's not right-wing, and he's not white, and he's not Christian. And so the panel has also mentioned that right-wing Jews will often excuse anti-Semites who support Israel or who hold similar political opinions. And I've heard the same thing about, not just from the panel, but more generally about anti-Semitic figures on the left and movements on the left. For instance, the Women's March continued to support Farrakhan despite a minor scandal that should have been a much larger scandal about repeated anti-Semitic statements. He's called Jews termites. He's talked about the synagogue of Satan, and yet he's met with congressmen, and when they were true as well. Yes, Obama met him, and the photo of that meeting wasn't revealed until after he was out of office, despite it occurring during the campaign. And so I just don't understand how this sort of anti-Semitism can be dismissed, especially when in Britain right now the Labour Party has been engulfed in a multi-year scandal around anti-Semitism. And so I wonder, do you see something similar potentially occurring here, given the acceptance that's already been displayed of people like Farrakhan?
Jonathan had talked about Black Lives Matter, but I wanted to talk about the very real problem with anti-Semitism in the women's movement. And when the Women's March, when they published their platform, and they set the decolonization of Palestine at the beating heart of that of the new feminist movement, and they demanded to I'm quoting from it, to dismantle all walls, from prison walls to border walls, from Mexico to Palestine. that Emily Shire called them out, called Linda Sarsour out, and Emily Shire is a journalist, and she said it in the New York Times, and she was saying, does the New Women's Movement have room for Zionists? And we know that over 80% of American Jews and American Jewish women in particular express either feel very strongly or moderately strongly that Israel is essential to their identities, their Jewish identities. And the anti-Semitism in the women's movement is, I think, a huge issue, and it's not a new issue. That's the problem. It goes back. You take a look, Letty Cotton Pogrebin wrote an article in the late 1960s about anti-Semitism, actually, I'm sorry, in the 80s, about anti-Semitism that they saw on display in the UN International Global Conferences, when the Jewish speakers were shouted down, when Jewish women were told not to carry bags that said things like American Jewish Congress because they would be called out. It's a historic problem, which, by the way, has roots in Christianity. And I think we're just seeing a new manifestation for it. So I think anti-Semitism coming from the left is also a very serious problem, but I don't think it tends to be violent, which is what we're seeing from the right. That's where I see a difference.
I think
Well, Barry, why don't you go and then I'll...
Well, what you talked about specifically with respect to Farrakhan is not anti-Semitism coming from the left. It's the left's refusal to call out Farrakhan's anti-Semitism. Now, that is a big difference. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, if you're going to call out white Christians, evangelicals, for their indifference to white Christian nationalism, you have got to call out the indifference of those on the left to Farrakhan's despicable, hateful, Judeophobic ranting. So,
would you say there's an equivalent to Farrakhan on the right who's as accepted by so many figures and as
I don't think, but I think part of the point is that I don't think anybody here is arguing that Farrakhan is an accepted figure of the left, right? I mean, I think that's true. He's not a...
But he is. Sarsour embraced him. Yeah, I mean, they refuse. The left refuses. The leaders in the women's movement refuse to denounce him.
Well, the deputy head of the Democratic Party is also used to work for the Nation of Islam back in the 90s. It took him a long time to finally condemn it, and he's still denying any connection.
I do want to add that there's an alternative interpretation of Linda Sarsour's statements, and that there's an op-ed piece in Haaretz about this, and that there has actually been a discussion specifically about Sarsour's statements that in fact her point isn't that is that anyone who refuses criticism of Israel, which is different to say that she excludes all Zionists, but she's basically, her statement is, if you're afraid to criticize the state of Israel, if you refuse to criticize the state of Israel, and that's the boundary line that she's making. Now, I think that there's interpretation, but there's definitely a debate about actually her stance towards it. And in her statement, I think if you read her interview in The Nation, that interpretation, or at least that reading, stands, that it's not anyone who expresses Zionism, because of course Zionism means many, as we've talked about, can mean many different things. But I do think that the Sarsour statement is a complicated one.
Yeah, but she's also said that she tells Shire, either stand up for the rights, I'm quoting, either stand up for the rights of all women, including Palestinians, or none. So she basically said, check your Zionism at the door. Yeah, I mean, it's just become a really, I think,
it's also a
significant
particular
problem.
interpretation of Zionism, right? Because
Yeah.
there's certainly manifestations of Zionism that recognize the humanity of Palestinians, but there are many forms of Zionism that don't, right? And maybe she should be making sort of better distinctions with those statements, but she's not entirely incorrect, I think. Maybe she should be parsing her language better. To the point of Farrakhan, I think you're absolutely right. That the left absolutely needs to call him out and not appear on stage with him, not embrace him. That's a disgrace on the left's part. I think we should also acknowledge what is the actual threat of Farrakhan to Jewish lives. I think it's actually quite small. Think about how many critics of Israel have murdered Jews in America, and the answer is none, right? How many white supremacists have murdered Jews, and the answer is many, many, right? Many Jews' lives. In truth, looking globally, millions upon millions of lives have been murdered by white supremacists, none by supporters of BDS or critics of Israel, at least in the States. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for staying with us. And I want to thank our panelists for their hard work. And I hope this is a conversation that continues and probably will need to continue for years to come. So